Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 17, where we will be talking about research methods in gender studies, starting with quantitative research methods in gender studies, and in the next lecture we will be talking about qualitative research methods in gender studies. So there are many ways to talk about research methods in social sciences, and what I will be doing in this lecture and in the next lecture is not really to give you the conventional ways, the conventional stages as we understand research methods to be, because those are primarily the same given any discipline. But what I will do in this lecture and in the next is to give you a fair sense of the ongoing debates in research methods in science, in social science. Particularly in this lecture, I will give you some basic ideas about how to design quantitative research. So what are the basic parameters that you need to keep in focus when you are designing research using quantitative principles. Then I will talk briefly about some of the ethical considerations that is true for any given social science research, and finally I will be talking a little bit about understanding the feminist methodology, understanding the principles of feminist methodology as they inform quantitative research methods, and to understanding qualitative research methods in the next lecture. So to start with an understanding of what as disciplines in science and in social science share and where they are dissimilar to each other. So if we take some standard definitions, we see that science, the understanding of science, is a set of logical, systematic, documented methods for investigating nature and natural processes, the knowledge produced by these investigations. So let's start by looking at what are some of the similarities and differences between the conventional science disciplines and the conventional social science disciplines, and what are the overlaps and points of departure for the two of them. So starting with the understanding of science, we see that science is a set of logical, systematic, documented methods for investigating nature and natural processes, the knowledge produced by these investigations. So you can see that the idea that there is a function of knowledge production is at the center of a scientific inquiry, and we have seen in the previous lectures how knowledge production, the context of knowledge production can be political, can be socially contextualized, and we have studied a few scholars, particularly Foucault, who have talked about the knowledge production in society and its implications. So this is something to keep in mind in crafting any sort of social science research also, that the context of knowledge production. On the other hand, if we take the definition of social science, the use of scientific methods to investigate individuals, societies and social processes, the knowledge produced by these investigations. So you see again that the context of knowledge production becomes important, increasingly important, particularly when we talk about societies, when we talk about individuals, when we talk about how many of these social processes that we have studied actually reflect, form patterns, produce patterns in society. So this is one of the starting points to understand that what sort of a method, what sort of research principles should one adopt, should a researcher adopt, particularly to do gender, research based on gender. And so what, whether you should go the quantitative way or whether you should go the qualitative way or you should go, a road in between is completely dependent on the types of research question that you are asking in doing that research. And the role of asking, the role of research question in this regard is probably one of the most important. What sort of question are you asking will determine the entire journey of your research. So if we ask the question that can we see the social world more clearly if we use the methods of social science, we see that again, understanding with the basic principles of how science operates and social science being part of that. So science relies on logical and systematic methods to answer questions. So there is a method to actually find out answers to particular questions, and it does so in a way that allows others to inspect and evaluate its methods. So you see that in a way it follows a particular method. So drawing from that, social scientists develop, refine, apply and report their understanding of the social world more systematically or scientifically than the general public does. So that is one of the added vantage points of doing social science research, that depending again on the type of question that you are asking, you have to develop certain research tools that will help you measure the processes, that help you find out the patterns. Refine the research tools because chances are that your the first draft of your research, the data collection tools may not work out. So you have to constantly refine, apply and then find ways of reporting your finding in a systematic and scientific manner. So this is one of the starting points of understanding of understanding how to do social science research with a focus on gender. So we also see that this reduces the likelihood of overgeneralization. So this is something that we have to constantly look out for, that because as I keep on saying that we have to understand the social context, we have to understand the context of time and space. So we should not, as social scientists, as social science researchers, we should always reduce the likelihood of overgeneralization by using systematic procedures for selecting individuals or groups to study, so that they are representative of the individuals or groups to which we wish to generalize. So choosing who you want to study, choosing, again going back to some of these previous lectures on this topic, we have been talking about units of analysis. So as you can see that while we are crafting a research protocol, research design, we constantly, social scientists constantly have to keep in mind to reduce the likelihood of overgeneralization. So as I kept on saying that most of these social science research, definitely research on gender, is contextualized in time and place, time and space, and so we should always keep a lookout on that. We are not overgeneralizing certain gender patterns, certain gender phenomena, and therefore who we select as individuals or who we select for our study, whether it's individuals or groups, it depends on the research design. So we have to be careful that they are representative of the individuals or groups to which we wish to generalize. So in other words, the units of analysis, as you are familiar with, have to be determined by you as the researcher, and whether a unit of analysis will be an individual person, or whether a unit of analysis will be a family, or whether a unit of analysis will be couples, spouses, or social groups. It's up to the research design how the question is asked, and selecting samples from the population is a crucial task in this respect. Also, when we adopt scientific methods such as these, they lessen the tendency to answer questions about the social world from an ego-based commitments, excessive devotion to tradition, and or unquestioning respect for authority. So here we are trying to do research about the social world, and answer questions that is free from several of these parameters, such as ego-based commitments, excessive devotion to bias, etc., or devotion to tradition, excuse me. So that is only going to introduce some sort of bias to the research. So the importance of adopting these scientific methods is very, very crucial. So as I said before, that in any research design, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, we have to start by asking the right questions, and something that we call the research question. So you will see that the way you craft a research question, or the way you craft a set of research questions, actually determine the next two phases of your research, that is data collection and data analysis. So the type of questions that you are asking will determine whether you will look at a particular unit of analysis, such as a person or a group, and therefore your data collection tools will be designed keeping that in mind. So the first important idea in this respect that you as a social science researcher have to keep in mind is asking questions that are feasible. So whether the research question you are asking is feasible. Is it feasible to carry out this research within the given time and other resources? So feasibility is very, very important. If you ask questions that are not really feasible, then you not only will you face various challenges while doing that research, it will also not give you the kind of results or the answers that you are looking for. So asking a question that is feasible is very, very important. The second characteristic that you have to be careful of is the question that you are asking of social importance. So you have to find out the importance, the social importance of the research question that you are asking, because that will determine a long way the next steps. So how much funding would you be getting, or what is your access to the research population, so on and so forth. And the third feature that you have to keep in mind in this respect is scientific relevance. So you have to ask research questions that are scientifically relevant. That a question will help you to do a social science research in a scientific manner. So these are the three key components, key characteristic features of crafting or designing any social science research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative or somewhere in between. With that, I just want to introduce some of the basic ideas that are used in quantitative research, particularly for social sciences. And here I do want to draw your attention to the ideas of how we understand variables. And a variable is the mathematical precision that you attach to something, and depending on that we have something called the nominal variable and something called the ordinal, interval and ratio variables. And as you can see on the screen, that a nominal variable oftentimes is qualitative. So for example, if you take dog breeds for example, it is very difficult to talk about say breed A and breed B or compare the two without having specified the parameters on which, based on which you are doing the comparison. So these are called nominal or qualitative variables. For quantitative variables, you have starting with the most simple of that, the ordinal variable, which is the greater than, less than comparison that we do. So in ordinal, for example, here you see that the size of a cup of tea or coffee, so whether something is larger than something, so greater than or less than. The order matters but difference do not matter, so that is ordinal variable. For an interval variable, the numbers represent fixed measurement units but have no absolute 0 point. So that is you're moving up the numerical scale here, that you're introducing numbers that represent a fixed measurement but they have no absolute 0 point. And for a ratio, you do have a fixed measuring unit with an absolute 0 point. So now let us look at some of these examples here that you see on the screen, that starting with these are usual typical questions that you see on survey forms. What is your gender? And you're given two variables, you have to tick male or female, and so you have to again choose and pick a variable. Or what is the hair color, or where do you live, or how do you feel today, or how satisfied are you with our service. So all of these, so you can see, and then you can see a temperature scale and a weight scale. So identify for yourself which of these would fall in the categories of nominal and ordinal and interval and ratio types of variables. Now, so if we look at data, that the idea of what sort of data that we are planning to collect or we have collected, we can measure it or just count it, quantitatively speaking. And the basic way of counting here in that case is ordinal and nominal, which is categorical, and measuring it is ratio by interval, which is numerical. So again this has to be carefully thought through when you are designing the research, that what sort of data analysis do you want to do with the given set of data. So another principle that you have to consider at this point is, what sort of research design do you want? Do you want a cross-sectional or do you want a longitudinal sort of research? A cross-sectional is to look at a particular phenomena or a particular pattern or a particular group of people given at only one point of time. So T is just one, there is no comparison, it is a cross-sectional study. For a longitudinal study, there can be various types of longitudinal study depending whether you are looking at the same group or people over different time periods or different groups of people over different time periods. So there can be different types of longitudinal research design, but what is constant in all of the longitudinal design is there is more than one time frame. So unlike in cross sectional where you are confined within one time frame, in a longitudinal you have the opportunity to look at either a transition of the same phenomena over time, or how different groups behave with regard to the same phenomena over different time. So time actually is the one of the most important determinants whether you are doing cross sectional or a longitudinal study. So one of the most popular ways of doing quantitative research is using surveys. So survey questions are answered as part of a questionnaire or interview schedule, as it is often called an interview based studies, not in isolation from other questions. And the context created by the questionnaire has a major impact on how individuals' questions are interpreted and whether they are even answered. So many of you are familiar with the idea of surveys. Either you have already designed surveys on your own, or you have participated in some sort of a survey. So you are familiar with how surveys work. Now what we have to understand here is how are these survey questions drafted, what goes on behind the scene for a researcher when somebody is adding questions to a survey. So it is definitely as you can see from the definition, the questions are definitely not in isolation from other questions. So there is a logical pattern to it, and the context created by the questionnaire has an impact on how the individual questions are interpreted and whether they are even answered. So when you're doing a research on gender, it is very, very important that your survey, if you're doing a survey for research, that the context that you create in this respect has an impact, a positive impact for the individuals, for the people who are actually answering your questions. Because if you tend to ask questions that are not welcoming, questions that are that can be problematic, then chances are that your informants, your research subjects will not even answer that question. So you as a researcher have to be very, very careful of how you are creating the context in the surveys. So one way of making sure that your survey questions are working is to pre-test and test the surveys. So pre-testing of some sort is an essential step in preparing any survey. So when you're crafting a particular question or a set of questions, it is important that you test it on somebody who is probably not going to be part of your research, but then just ask those questions to somebody else to see how she or he is responding to that question. One important form of feedback results from simply discussing the questionnaire content with others. So as I said, that it is important that you as a researcher are thinking that probably these questions are going to be helpful, these questions are going to be meaningful for you, but it may not be so for the people who are you planning to get the survey results from. Another increasingly popular form of feedback comes from guided discussions among potential respondents, which is called focus groups, to check for consistent understanding of terms and to identify the range of events or experiences about which people will be asked to report. So this is increasingly, focus groups are increasingly becoming important to understand social phenomena, to understand social processes, particularly when you talk of gender as a process in society, where you have multiple people, when you have a group of respondents together in one given place and time, and there is a constant conversation that goes on between the researcher who is collecting data and this group of people who form the focus group, who then identify a range of events, a range of experiences with regard to the phenomena, to the process that you are trying to study, and there is a constant and effective exchange between these people. Just to give you an example in this respect, several of the rural areas in India, they have something called the self-help groups of women who usually get together on particular days of the week, and they discuss the problems in that village or problems in that society, and there is a discussion, there is a meeting amongst them with regard to a particular process. Now, if you as a researcher want to study that particular society, that particular village, then it may be helpful to actually have meetings with these self-help groups as your focus groups, where you have participants who share the same experience, and they have some sort of something to say with regard to the social process that you are trying to understand. So, that is one example of how you can actually conduct focus groups research. Now, the question is, once you have identified your survey research questions, how will you administer it? How will you conduct your survey? And there are these various ways in which you can actually conduct a survey. You can either mail a paper copy of the survey to your prospective respondents. You can administer them in a group. You can do a telephone survey. When you call up random research subjects and ask them about certain questions. You can do it electronically, which is taking an online survey where you make your survey and post it online, and people either download the form or they do it do the survey online. Or you can do an in-person survey where you physically actually go and meet a person, and you talk to that person with regard to the survey questionnaire, and you collect data in person. So, these are some of the significant ways in which you can actually conduct a survey. Of course, each of these have their advantages and disadvantages. Oftentimes it is seen that if you mail a survey, a paper copy, it's not always sent back to you in the completed form. So, that is one disadvantage of mailing surveys. The conducting of surveys electronically sometimes proves to be very effective, where you can actually remind people. If you know your research subjects, you can constantly remind people that it's very important for you to do this research, and therefore please fill out the survey form, etc. Or probably the most effective way of getting data using a survey is in person. And this is because it is not just you as a researcher who is interacting face to face with your research subject, but you also have an opportunity of clarifying certain questions, certain contexts, if there is a requirement for your research subject. So, in person, a face to face data collection is always more effective, whether it's a survey or an interview. So, as I said, that in-person interviews are the strongest design and generally preferable when sufficient resources and a trained interview staff are available. So, if you are doing heavily interview based research, then you need resources such as people who will be able to conduct interviews for you, unless you want to conduct all these interviews all by yourself, which is highly recommended. But then they are the strongest research design methods for collection of data. Telephone surveys have many of the advantages of in-person interviews at much less cost. Rates are an increasing problem. So, telephone surveys are the next best way to go, because here again you are not present in person, but you are able to call up somebody to ask these questions directly, and if the person on the other end is willing to answer your questions, you have an opportunity to clarify certain questions again if there is a requirement. So, the next best option after the in-person interviews would be telephone surveys. And any decision about the best survey design for any particular study must take into account the unique features and goals of the study. So, again, coming back to the points that it depends on what sort of questions are you asking and what is your research design that you want to engage in will identify the type of research methods, the data collection methods that you will adopt for that study. There are some ethical considerations that are true for any given social science research, and starting with the idea of honesty and openness. So, I will not go into greater details of these ethical considerations because there are a lot of materials available on ethical considerations. I just want to emphasize here that this is something that cannot be ignored. So, please do some additional readings on the ethics of social science research, particularly with respect to honesty and openness when you are dealing with human subjects as your research subjects. The uses of science, of scientific relevance and social considerations. So, it's an obligation that you have to the discipline of social sciences that you adhere to the principles of scientific relevance to your social considerations, and of course, you are dealing with human subjects as your research subjects. So, confidentiality and if required anonymity. So, these are very, very important ethical considerations for social science research, that once you collect data from a human being, from your research subject, you have to even before starting out that research, you have to have something called an informed consent. So, you have to have some sort of a consent given to you by the research subject that yes, you can start the research, and yes, the data that you will be collecting can be used for research. So, starting with informed consent to assuring confidentiality, that none of this data that has been collected will be used in elsewhere unless otherwise stated or agreed upon. So, this idea of confidentiality, this idea of anonymity, that to keep your research subjects anonymous, becomes increasingly important with the various ways of data collection and analysis methods that are emerging in social science research. So, having said that, let's look at something that is understood in social science research as the research circle. So, this is a circle that establishes a relationship between theory and data. So, both theory and data are very meaningful components of any given research, and here in this research circle, as you can see, that if depending on the type of route that you want to take, whether you want to go from theory to hypothesis to data collection and then to generalization and then going back to theory, if you start from theory and go formulate a hypothesis with an existing theory, and then you decide on your data collection strategies, then you are doing something that is called a deductive research. that something that is originating from a theory and going towards data collection following a hypothesis based on the theory. Now, if you do a research for which a theory is not well established or not known, or you want to investigate something that is very emerging in a social situation, and you want to start from data. So what you want to do is start looking at social patterns, social processes, and that emerges as your data, and from there you can probably generalize some parts of the process. Be careful of not to overgeneralize, and after generalization you can move towards an idea of theory building, that you are using the data that you have collected to do an acceptable level of generalization and build a theory out of it. So this relationship between data and theory in any given social science research is to make connections, and the way that social theories are built and they are evaluated, they actually form as a logically interrelated set of propositions about empirical reality, that is the social world as it actually exists. So if you break down, if you understand what theories are, what social theories are, social theories are nothing but these interrelationship between a set of propositions about social reality. And some scholars actually call social theory basic survival skills. It's a very, very prominent thing to say, and scholars have used this idea. And you see that producing a social theory is again possible with regard to a social context. So if you look back to some of the classical social theories, the ideas of Marxism, or the principles of Weber or the principles of Durkheim, if you look at these classic social theories, you will see that there has been particular social processes, particular social contexts which have given rise to ideas or principles of Marxism, which has given rise to principles that Weber proposed, principles that Durkheim proposed. So these are, so no social theory is out of this social context. So to produce a social theory, it matters, it is important that you understand the society that you are studying, the group that you are studying well, and you collect some data through scientifically crafted research tools, and then you move towards the idea of theory building through a process of empirical generalization, through a process of generalization that is evidence based, that is your data becomes your evidence to form a theory. So the role of theory again is very, very important in social science research, particularly when we talk of categories such as gender. So with this, I want to introduce you to some of the ideas, again going back to the understanding that there is a very important linkage between theory and methods, and going back to the idea of why do we need to know whether we will be adopting a qualitative approach or a quantitative approach. One of the starting points to understand the objectivity subjectivity debate is understanding the classic premise of positivism, which emerged as an approach to scientific knowledge that seeks facts and general laws which will enable the researcher to predict behavior. So, positivism was one of the classic premises that was forwarded by earlier sociologists, and this approach of using scientific knowledge base to predict human behavior using or seeking facts and general laws was one of the first endeavors, one of the first attempts to understand the object subject relationship. However, we see that historically, as you have seen, the growth or the journey of gender as a concept, gender as a process from a purely biological understanding has given rise to several of these methodological principles which kind of could not be explained purely by the positivism approach. In fact, we have feminist methodology that departs from positivism based on a denial of the possibility of objective research outcomes and a denial of the desirability of truly objective data collection techniques. So, we see that more and more as the nature of inquiry changed, the nature of types of doing research changed over the decades, we see that there was a departure, there was a move away from the objective type of research, and this was possible and this was required because gender as a category, gender as a concept itself turned out to be a fluid concept, turned out not to be an objective concept, but a subjective work in progress idea, and therefore although positivism was one of the starting points to understand human behavior, the advent of new forms of feminist methodology actually departs from the principles of positivism. And we see that the principles forwarded by Kuhn and Luckman actually that all knowledge, including scientific knowledge, is socially constructed. So, we are talking particularly about gender here, that if you take any knowledge that is produced around the idea of gender, performance, gender patterns, gender relationship, if you take any concept that revolves around gender, you will see that the knowledge that is produced around that is socially constructed. It means that it is again contextualized in that particular time and society. So, it is very difficult to talk about gender without contextualizing it. It is probably impossible to talk about gender without contextualizing it. So, we also need to look at how certain epistemological journeys have fared in this respect of conceptions of what is knowledge, what is science, and how do we come to know things. So, this is again a reflective exercise that a researcher, a social science researcher would have to do a back and forth with, that what are these stages, at what point do we realize that this is a research design that we need to do. This is whether it's quantitative or qualitative, how do we want to understand the knowledge that will be produced, and what are the various ways we can actually report such analysis. The next idea here is understanding the qualitative quantitative divide. So, you will see that in social science textbooks or social science research, that this is an ongoing debate. This debate has been there for quite some time, and it is an ongoing debate. So, while qualitative research, it refers to the collection and analysis of materials that seeks to uncover meanings from the data. Quantitative research is more about collection of numerical data. So, we see that this constant dialogue of data as qualitative or data as quantitative, data as numbers or data as textual or in other forms. As you will see that there are multiple forms of qualitative data, not just text. So, you will see that one is the nature of the data. So, whether you have numbers or whether you have a text or a picture or something else. So, that is the nature of data. The other divide comes in a form of how you are reporting that data. So, whether are you reporting a particular set of data in a quantitative way or in a qualitative way. So, this distinction between the qualitative and the quantitative can be done at least two levels, in whether while you are collecting data or while you are analyzing that data. So, I would go back to the understanding of feminist methodology here and point out that in 96 DeWalt actually talked about the distinctiveness of feminist methodology can be located in the shared commitment to three goals, and the three goals are: feminists seek a methodology that will do the work of excavation, shifting the focus of standard research practice from men's concerns in order to reveal the locations and perspectives of all women. So, what the first point is saying is that previously or historically, as the discipline of sociology emerged, it tended to be as some researchers have termed it, to be androcentric, and and there has to be a shift from understanding only men's concern in order to reveal the locations and perspectives of women. So, that was the first conceptual journey in terms of methodology that was done in this regard. The next point: feminists seek a science that minimizes harm and control in the research process. So, how can as a feminist social science researcher, can you minimize the harm and control in the research process? And the third point, that feminists seek a methodology that will support research of value to women, leading to social change or action beneficial to women. Together, these criteria for feminist methodology provide the outline for a possible alternative to the distant, distorting and dispassionately objective procedures of mass social research. So, as you can see, if you take a summary of these 3 points, that there is a call, there is a conscious effort to shift from an understanding of an objective reality to a more subjective, more contextual reality. And much of these call actually comes from the way in which sociology as a discipline emerged and grew out of social contexts, and it is an evolving discipline just like many other disciplines. So, this is a call that comes from the scholars professing feminist methodology, that there is a need to understand the relationship, the subjective relationship in any given research, particularly when we talk of socially constructed ideas such as gender. So, here you can see a very good comparison between quantitative and qualitative methodologies, and as you will go through this chart, you will see that the search for general laws and behavior has been one of the guiding principles of quantitative methods, while the search for meanings in specific social cultural contexts is or has been the guiding principle for qualitative methods. For quantitative, as we have seen, that objectivity is valued, and then for qualitative, subjectivity is the is sought for. And then we see that for quantitative research, we look for statistical causality, and for qualitative research, we look for an understanding that is that has a historical connotation, that has a particular historical background, so historical causality. Now, given the nature of research that a researcher can do using quantitative methods, it is possible to do large scale studies, but the type of research that maybe a purely qualitative research would call for will often use a small scale sample groups. And then as we talked about that the basic principles of quantitative methods is rooted in understanding of deduction or deductive method, and for qualitative research it's based in inductive methods or grounded theory, as we will see in the next lecture. For again, given the nature of quantitative principles, research principles, the use of survey instruments is probably one of the most effective ways to collect data. And for qualitative research, we see that open-ended research questions or open-ended research tools or instruments, which basically comprises semi-structured interviews, are the most effective ones. And finally, how you measure in quantitative terms is through numbers, and for qualitative you see the use of words, the use of qualitative sources such as texts, words, pictures, cinema, and the list goes on, and it is supposedly understood to be what Clifford Geertz actually called the thick description. So these are some of the points of comparison between quantitative and qualitative research. Also inherent in this understanding is the idea of power relations. So in any given social science research, particularly on gender, you have to at some point of time bring in, or you have to actually highlight or show how several of these power relations are negotiated in society based on gender. So starting with the first point, that it is linked with the object subject debate of bringing in the idea of unequal power relations, that in an objective type of a research, the power relation is not quite prominent. The power relation between the researcher and the research is not talked about. And in a subjective sort of debate in research, you see that there is a power relation that is going on, and the focus is probably the power relation exists for both object and objective and subjective types of research, but then how much of it is talked about in the research report varies. The second point, that feminists writing on the intersection between gender, race, class and sexuality. So this is again going back to the whole discussion that we had in previous lectures on the idea of intersectionality, the idea that gender actually crosses path with other axes of differences such as race, class, sexuality, and it is important that one it is practically impossible not to talk about power relations in this regard. So it becomes increasingly important to factor in the idea of how power negotiations are understood when we have the intersectionality lens. And finally, we have to move beyond the simple add in and stir model. If you recall, the first few lectures on of this topic, that there was a time in history when it was brought into focus that women were increasingly left out of the conversation as research subjects, and there was a phase of time when it was proposed of adding women and stirring into the discussion. So the add in and stir model is has not been the recommended road to go. So you have to have a more intricate, a more well thought out, a well crafted way of understanding gender in society based on people's experiences, based on people's social contexts. So adding an ingredient or retrofitting something to a conversation is probably not going to help. So there was a need to move beyond that simple adding in and stirring model, and with increasing focus on how people in society experience certain contexts, experience certain phenomena, has been one of the guiding principles to understand such power relations. So we have seen that if we can recall from some of the previous lectures how gender as an analytical category has evolved, that we have seen that gender has evolved to be a qualitative concept, which often has talked about domestic power relations, and it has emphasized on couples' work strategies, the ideas of pay gap, and then the redefinition of work to include unpaid care work and informal labor. So we have seen that there are various ways in which gender has shifted over time as an analytical category. So here with this idea that something that is so analytical, something that is so subjective, I want to bring in DeWalt again here, that feminist methodologies do not use or prescribe any research method. Rather, they are united through various methods to include women's lives and concerns in accounts of society, to minimize the harms of research and to support changes that will improve women's status. So as you can see that the call of a feminist methodological principle here is not to prescribe or not to include any particular research method, but the principles are different. The principles are to bring into context these various accounts or experiences that particularly women face in society, and to improve a social understanding of people, a social understanding of women's status in society. So so with this I want to conclude by asking you to look up that what are some of the significant challenges of using purely quantitative methods for gender analysis. So we have talked about what can be some of the challenges, and I want you to identify what are some of these significant challenges. And if you want to take a look at the book by Ramzanoglu with feminist methodology, and by Sharmila Rege, Sociology of Gender, you can read up how feminist methodology as a process has evolved over time with regard to research methods. So with that, I want to conclude this lecture by asking you to do a little assignment on what are the significant challenges of using quantitative methods for gender analysis. If you want to read further, please take a look at these two books, and then in the next lecture we will continue talking about research methods in gender studies, particularly talking about qualitative research. Thank you.